Um, it's a great pleasure to be here. The title of my talk is Beyond the Ivory Tower, Cultural Politics and Public Pedagogy. I'm going to be speaking about public intellectuals, and actually I think Henry is the epitome of what a public intellectual should be in terms of the scale and scope of his work, and how he gets it out to diverse audiences. He's really been a model actually for my own life as well. If you want to get a more elaborate discussion of some of the things I'm going to be talking about, I have a website, and there are some downloadable articles there, and there's some interviews especially that deal with the kinds of issues that I'm going to be talking about. I also did an interview actually last year with a Canadian journal. I think it's based in Ryerson actually, called Alternate Roots. It's a sociology journal. Actually, it was the place where I had my first publication as a grad student, so it holds a special place in my heart. And I did an interview that deals with many of those issues for Alternate Roots. And I want to speak today both theoretically and personally. I hope not too personally. It's not going to be I hope personally enough that you can see why it matters, but not in a way that is particular. In a way that I hope that you'll be able to draw out broader implications for my own case. Although I'm often referred to as a scholar, an activist, a filmmaker, I actually don't really think of myself in those ways exclusively. I actually prefer to think of myself as a teacher that is moving that practice beyond my own classroom into the culture broadly conceived. And I want to speak today specifically, given the occasion, I want to speak specifically today about teaching as a cultural practice. As academics, it's the major thing that we do, and it's never discussed as something vital. Right? Teaching is always that stuff you kind of have to do, but the other stuff is supposed to be much more important. Research, even service sometimes is seen as more important than the teaching function. I think it's very strange. We're never trained in teaching, unless we get some special award or fellowship that allows us to focus on teaching for a semester. It's never talked about. It's a very strange phenomenon. The very thing that we do the most is what we think about the least. And we kind of do it, we're all of us self-taught. As I said, it's a very strange thing. Just a brief background on myself. I emerged from the tradition of both political economy and critical cultural studies. And I'll talk about critical cultural studies in particular, and especially that associated with Stuart Hall and the Birmingham Center for Contemporary Cultural Studies. I didn't study there, but it provided a very powerful influence on my own development. As I'm sure many of you know, Stuart Hall passed away just over a year ago. And I've been thinking a great deal as a result about his life and his work. And you'll see, I'm going to talk very directly actually about Stuart and his notion of pedagogy as a cultural practice, as a broad cultural practice. I want to talk about Stuart as an influence on my own theoretical and pedagogical development. Now, if Hall is an influence, then so, of course, is Marxism. Okay, not as a dogmatic framework, but as a series of questions and conversations. And the best tradition of cultural studies has always had this kind of inside-outside relationship with Marxism. Cultural studies has never been, you can never describe it as a Marxist cultural practice or a Marxist cultural theory, but it's in constant dialogue with Marxism. As I said, it's this inside-outside relationship. Here is how Stuart Hall describes his relationship with Marxism, both as an anti-imperialist struggle, but also as an anti-Stalinist struggle as well. And Hall says that the new left, the first new left, actually not the new left of the 1960s, which he calls the second new left, but the first new left, he says, actually emerged in the conjuncture of 1956, in that year when the Suez crisis hit, and British and French and Israeli airplanes bombed Egypt, and in the same year in which Soviet tanks moved in to Budapest to crush the rebellion there. He says, this is Stewart now, talking about this directly. He says, in that sense, I came into Marxism backwards. By the way, that's a very Hawleyan way of saying things. He's in Marxism, but he says he kind of came in kicking and screaming. I came into Marxism backwards, against the Soviet tanks in Budapest, as it were. What I mean by that is certainly not that I wasn't profoundly, and that cultural studies then wasn't from the beginning, profoundly influenced by the questions that Marxism as a theoretical project put on the agenda. The power, the global reach and history-making capacities of capital, the question of class, the complex relationships between power and exploitation, the question of a general theory which could, in a critical way, connect together in a critical reflection different domains of life, politics and theory and practice, economic, political, ideological questions, and so on. The notion of critical knowledge itself as the production of critical knowledge as a practice. I want to focus on, and I want to talk a great deal today about that, those last few words, as a practice. He says, these important central questions are what one meant by working within shouting distance of Marxism, working on Marxism, working against Marxism, working with it, working to try and develop Marxism. And I want to argue that a focus on these kinds of questions, so when you hear the word Marxist, that's what I mean. It's actually this discourse, it's these series of critical conversations and discussions that I think need to be reinvigorated and given fresh impetus. Actually, one of the things, when Hall died last year, he was buried, I'm sure some of you know, he was buried at Highgate Cemetery, which is the resting place of Marx as well. And I have this fantasy of that Stewart's lifelong discussion with Marx is going to go on well into well into eternity. It'd be really interesting to see what goes on at night at Highgate Cemetery. Of course, that corner of Highgate Cemetery is the most left-wing place, most probably on the planet, in terms of who's buried there. So the conversations will be really thing. I want to argue, as I said, for the focus on these kinds of questions, and that's my theoretical concern. And whatever I've done, those concerns, even though they're not expressed explicitly that way, those concerns have never left me. That being said, I suspect my invitation here and the reason why you may have heard of me is to do with my role as founder and executive director of the Media Education Foundation. This is the website that Henry mentioned in the introduction, where you can see all the films that we've done. The Media Education Foundation started, even though now it's films, the Media Education Foundation started in the classroom. And almost everything that has happened since that time has come from those circumstances. Sometimes there's a tendency or there's a temptation to make a narrative of historical events after the fact, as though I had this great plan that was there was never a plan. You're always just responding to things as they happen, and you hope you make the best choices you can, given the understanding that you have. But I think there are lessons to be learned as we think about the future. And so I want to talk a little bit about the Media Education Foundation started in the classroom. It started actually with this. It didn't start as a film, but what Henry mentioned, what came out became Dreamworld, which was the analysis of MTV. So this was a long time ago. This was in the mid-1980s. I just started teaching. I was teaching very large lecture classes at the University of Massachusetts, Intro to Mass Communication. I'm sure you have them. You have them here as well. And at that time, MTV was at the center of the culture. That was what students were thinking about. And I thought if I wanted to get students to think seriously about the culture in which they're immersed, if I could get them thinking about seriously, in some kind of nuanced way, in distanced way, about MTV, then that would be a useful thing to do from a pedagogical perspective. At that time, one of the major issues when MTV first broke, when it first came out, and it still is right until the present time, is to do with representations of femininity and sexuality, and connections of that with attitudes and with sexual violence, etc. So that was at the center of the culture. It's also interesting, this is an aside, when MTV first broke, when it first was formed, it was actually a white-only channel. There were no black artists featured on MTV because it was presumed that the target audience for MTV was white suburban kids, and it was presumed at that time that they didn't listen to black music. And so when you look at the first few years of MTV, it is entirely, I mean, talk about apartheid. It is a whites-only space. The person who broke that was, it's tough, I mean, it will require its own discussion, was Michael Jackson. And Thriller was what actually broke that, was what broke the color line, as it were. So I wanted to talk about these images that you know, my students were surrounded by, that they were engaged with. And so in the classroom, so you know, you can't talk about these images without having those images to look at. So I started to bring those images in. And this was 30 years ago. Many of you may remember, some of you may not, but there used to be this thing called VCRs, and there used to be a thing called VHS tapes. And you used to put this tape into a machine and you could record things off the air. And so this was, I had never edited, I had never done anything. All I had was a VCR machine. And so I would go home and I would put a VHS tape in the machine and would, you know, tape for half an hour, and I would take another one out. And so I had a series of these, you know, of these tapes. And then when I went into the classroom, when I wanted to use them, I would, you know, I would put a VHS tape into the machine. You know, play a little bit of it, then I would take it out and I have to put another one in. I may have to rewind it. And of course, the first thing I learned was, the first pedagogical lesson I learned was, you can't do that in a large lecture class. The moment you stop, the moment you rewind, the moment you change, you have lost them. You have lost them. And there's no way of getting them back after that. Once the group takes over, you're dead. And so what I decided to do was, you know, a new academic, a new teacher. I didn't really know what I was doing. I thought, okay, well, I'm going to take that obstacle out. And that was the first time I thought about editing. That was the first thing that came out of teaching. I was like, actually, what if I put these things on the same tape so I don't have this gap in between, so that you can lose them. And so I started editing these clips together. And initially, I would edit them together, and I would leave the music on. And initially, there would be like a minute of this or a minute of that. And of course, you know, if I left the music on, what did students do? They sang along with the music. Right? And if you sing along with the music, it's very tough to have an analytical perspective when you're there as a fan. So the next thing I did, I stripped off the music. And I wanted them to focus on the images. I stripped off the music, and I put on this really, there's this German ambient band called Tangerine Dream. Some of you may have heard of it. And I put that music on, and it did nothing. I mean, it was really, you know, sinister and made you think about the images. And then over a period of time, and the images would be going on. This music would now be playing, and then I would still be talking through it. And then eventually, I said, "Oh, I'll just put my voice on the tape." And so my voice, instead of being here, went onto the tape. And this was after, I would say, about 4 or 5 years, I had finally a kind of standalone piece. So the idea of a film didn't emerge from me like I should make a film on this. It actually came from the pedagogical practice in the classroom and from what worked and what did not work. And eventually I had this standalone piece. I'll play you this is Dreamworlds 3, which I did about. There's been 3 versions of it. You have to constantly update this otherwise. With new content, of course, otherwise it's totally irrelevant to 18, 19-year-old students. So it actually needs to be updated right now. It's been a while, but this was what Dreamworlds was.
Since MTV first started operation in 1981 by playing this video from the Buggles, entitled "Video Killed the Radio Star," music videos have become a central and vital component of the music, entertainment, and media industries. No longer limited to just one channel, they have spread out to the entire culture and across musical genres, from pop to rock to metal to rap and hip-hop to country. They have moved from the margins of the culture and relative innocence to its very center and into a cauldron of controversy around the nature of the sexual imagery that quickly came to define it as a genre. In fact, from their very origins, music videos, like other forms of advertising, have relied very heavily on stories concerning.
I mean, again, I learned this was my third version. The first version I'm actually embarrassed even to look at nowadays in terms of the technical, the technical quality. At that time it was fine, but things have moved on. Actually, the other thing I just realized when I looked at this, actually, I'm not too sure if I do need a Dreamworld 3, because a lot of those artists are still there. Rihanna is still there, Jay-Z is still there. I mean, actually shows how little has sometimes has changed in popular culture. That these, Madonna is what, 70 years old now and still there. She's in one sense, the more things change, the more they remain the same. My strategy was, and so I was thinking, and I think this is in terms of pedagogy. My strategy was a strategy of disruption. When these images are so familiar, when these images are inside people, when people live their identities through these images, how do you get that distance? And the only way to get it is to disrupt. And the strategy that I chose at that time, I thought about it, didn't really choose it, I thought about it, was I'm just going to flood these images. So people aren't going to look at them in kind of, little bits and bobs. I'm just going to flood these images of people, and it's, and I'm going to make people sick of these images of pleasure. Now, partly was, could I turn images of pleasure into something else? It was a challenge. It was a challenge. I mean, I remember I used to get some comments from some of my students, some male students, who said, "Wow, great! When you first started showing this, we're going to get like 15 minutes of this." I was, I was like, totally psyched. And then they said, "Well, yeah." Then after about 10 minutes, I just started to get sick of it. After about 10 minutes, I just didn't end because the pleasure was gone. It was decontextualized. And they had to deal then with these images in a different way. That's a pedagogy of disruption. It's a politics of disruption. I think if you're going to do, in a culture, if you're dealing with a population in which they are being flooded the rest of their time, the rest of their lives, with this corporate propaganda, then the classroom is one of the few places where they have a chance to think about it and where you can actually disrupt. And if we're not disrupting, I actually don't know. I don't mean disrupting for disrupting's sake. If we're not getting people to think about the world in which they live in a new way, what's the point? At that point, pedagogy is not transformative. At that point, if that's not what it's doing, it's simply reproduction. It's simply reproducing what's already there. It seems to me the only pedagogy worth really doing and worth thinking about is a pedagogy of disruption. So I had this tape. So I had this thing, this VHS tape that was now a standalone piece. And I thought, well, if it's useful to me, perhaps it might be useful to some other people. And so I did a very small mailing. There was no MEF at this point, no Media Education Foundation, just me, as teaching at the university. And so I did a very small mailing to some women's studies departments, to other communication departments, seeing if they would be useful to them. And we sold, all the money was coming back to the department. We sold, I don't know, 50 copies or something. It wasn't very much. And I'm not too sure what would have happened, to tell you the truth. I wasn't a filmmaker. I wasn't committed to this as a pedagogy kind of had developed out of this particular example. But then actually fate took a hand. And one day I received a letter from MTV Networks, more specifically from the legal department of MTV Networks. It was a cease and desist letter that told me that I had to cease and desist what I was doing because they argued these images that I was using did not belong to me, they belonged to them. It was their copyrighted material. Actually, MTV was wrong. It wasn't their copyrighted material. It was the copyrighted material of the record companies that produced the videos as ads for the CDs they were selling. So they didn't know what they were talking about right from the start. But they essentially was, I said, not yours, ours, you have no permission. I wrote back very nicely, I thought, telling them, actually, there is this thing in the US, anyway, I think it's actually different in Canada, in the US called fair use. That's part of the Copyright Act, and that says, yes, there is copyright, and that, yes, there is intellectual property, but under certain conditions, intellectual property does not hold. If someone wants to comment on, critique your work, then your copyright does not hold in that case. And I very nicely, I thought, pointed this out to them, writing back. And I never really did hear from them again, because at the same time, the letter actually had come, both the letter, the cease and desist letter, had come to both myself and to the university, of which I was an employee. And so there were university lawyers and university administrators involved in this. In fact, I think it's the highest level meeting I've ever been at UMass, where I think the provost was there and with these high-priced lawyers trying to figure out what they did. And they said, well, we think you're covered by fair use. So they recognize that. These are the university administrators and lawyers, but they said, we just don't do anything. We don't want you to do anything. Just keep quiet and you'll go away. And I said, you're crazy. This is a really great opportunity to make a statement about academic freedom, about freedom of expression, about fair use, about and they said this is the key. They said, if you do, you will no longer be covered by university lawyers. So that was at that point I had to make a decision. Was I going to remain inside the university, or was I going to remain, or was I going to go outside? I remember when I got the letter, I couldn't quite believe they'd done it. I remember walking down to my colleague Justin Lewis, and I said, "You wouldn't believe what they've done. They've just given me like $1 million worth of publicity if I can play this the right way." At the same time, I was trembling with fear, because you don't want to be sued by a multi-million multinational corporation. But anyway, I decided at that point to set up MEF, the Media Education Foundation, to separate myself from the university. So in fact, I didn't have to deal with, excuse any lawyers or any university lawyers that might be in the room, I didn't have to deal with idiotic lawyers. And I didn't have to deal with administrators. I didn't have to deal with committees. If MEF had remained within the university, it would have been dead within 2 years. It would have been killed by governance through committee. And what MEF gave me was independence. I was able to, I had 1 foot inside the university I was teaching, and I had 1 foot outside in the world of MEF. Since that time, MEF has produced, as Henry said, we've produced ourselves over 60, I think it might be 70 films by now. We distribute a lot more, and it's given me independence in terms of the type of films that we produce. Given our business model, what we did was we make films and we sell them to the university market. We sell them so people can use them in classrooms. We sell them to libraries, essentially. That's our major market. So we don't rely upon money from, we're a non-profit, but we don't rely upon money from foundations. And that gave us independence. Didn't have to worry about what a foundation officer thought. Didn't have to worry about, we could actually do things on issues that we thought were important to look at. They couldn't be done in any other way. And we have looked at issues, we've looked at subjects that I think would have been impossible to get funded. The most pertinent one on that, I would say, we did a film, and we're doing another one right now on media representations of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the US, it is the one topic on the left you cannot talk about. Actually, I'd say that I'm not quite sure how you can be on the left and not have a position on that, which some people do. It's left on everything except Palestine is the category. But it's allowed us to produce things, given us independence. And you wouldn't give that up. Now, having said that, the major impact, I think, of MEF has been in the college classroom. There's other places as well. Our films have been shown on television. mostly around the rest of the world, not in the United States. The US system is locked down by corporations, including public television. It is impossible to get anything on the main airwaves there. Our films have been shown on cable channels, satellite channels, and as I said, they've been shown around the world. They've been shown in community groups. They're used by lots of non-profits, etc. So there is a wide distribution, but the core of it is the college classroom. And the influence of MEF has always been connected to that teaching function. And I would, someone said there's only one audience that you can focus on, I actually would settle for the college classroom. I would actually settle for that, because I actually think it is a place where transformation can take place. There's a potentiality of transformation. Why? Because they are a captive audience. That's the power that academics have. Not the power of propaganda, but the power of choosing topics that people have to deal with in an honest way, in an intellectually honest way. That is the power that teachers at a university have, and I wish that more teachers would use it. I know a lot of people do use that, and our films have become a way of people who may not have the expertise to be able to deal with a particular topic, of a way of actually introducing that topic in. And so our films, I think, have opened up the space for discussions that otherwise actually would not have taken place. And in one sense, when we look at, I think when you think about pedagogy, the issue is always about audiences. Well, who is your audience? Who are you trying to reach? And if in a classroom like this, I'm not going to talk about this audience, in a classroom like this, but in one sense, the MEF audience, we kind of joke about it. The MEF audience is actually that kid. I've actually gendered it over the years. It's normally a guy sitting there in his baseball cap, might belong to one of the frats, and he's really trying not to pay attention. And in the old days, he'll be reading a newspaper. Nowadays, it's on his Facebook page, just trying to, he's just trying not to, thinking that if he just was in the classroom somehow, he would, by osmosis, that he would learn something. And I think what the role of teaching is not to give up on that back row, but it's to reach into the back row. But it's to get him to look up from his Facebook page for a second and say, oh, hold on, this looks kind of interesting, or I wouldn't say interesting, this looks relevant. And to start thinking about the issues that you want them to talk about. That's where politics takes place. That's where transformative pedagogy takes place. It also takes place in the front row, in the middle row. People are in different parts of the room for different reasons, and you have to, people in the front are there for a different kind of reason, and you have to be able to talk to them as well and make it transformative for them as well. And that requires a strategy of pedagogy. That requires us to think about these things in ways that we have never been encouraged to think. By the way, there is no guarantee of success. Right? If you want guarantee, just speak to people who already agree with you, and then you'll have total guarantee. You'll have total, everyone will agree with you, and you'll have zero transformation, and you'll have total guarantee. Politics is about no guarantees. That was Stuart Hall's famous phrase. No guarantees. But there is no possibility of transformation without struggle. There's no guarantee that the struggle will work. How well we do that, how well we do that work, how successful we are in it, will depend upon how well we do it. And I think the key term is translation. How can we translate our work into a form that can be comprehended by non-specialists? And I think there's not enough attention being paid here. I said, I would settle for the classroom. I make documentaries, and they'd be great if they were shown in theaters. But who goes to a theater to watch a documentary and pay their $10? People already agree. People already know that it's important to look at this stuff, right? I wouldn't turn that up. But that's again it's not transformative. Teaching, I think, is political. The idea of translation, we don't pay enough attention to. And I would take my lead here. go back to the beginning, I take my lead actually here from Marx. And I want you to think about Marx as a public intellectual of his time. He was a great public intellectual. He wrote a huge number of pieces as a journalist. But his major work also, I think, you can think of in terms of public pedagogy. He wrote something called the Grundrisse, which was never published in his lifetime. The reason it was never published is it was never meant to be published. The Grundrisse are Marx's notebooks. They're his mind in operation, and as such, they're unreadable. Now, believe me, I tried for many years to read the Grundrisse, and it is unreadable because there is no narrative in it. This is Marx. This is like your notes. No one can make sense of your notes if you're just thinking about things. This is Marx's mind in operation, where he works out his great economic theory, where he works out the logic of capitalism, where he works out the logic of surplus value. He then publishes it in 1867 in Capital, the great, his major work. And we know his major work because he goes back and revises it while he's still alive. Volumes 2 and 3 are put out by Engels after Marx's death. Volume 1 is what Marx concentrated on and concentrated on a lot. And it is an incredible piece of work. It is an incredible piece. It's a rhetorical tour de force. This is the opening lines of Capital. He says, the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of commodities, its unit being a single commodity. Our investigation must therefore begin with the analysis of a commodity. That's not where the Grundrisse starts off. You look at the Grundrisse and it's all, I don't even know where the Grundrisse starts off. It's not there. This is where he ends up after thinking about what the correct starting point for an exposition should be. Not the fast starting point of analysis, the starting point of exposition. And Marx spent many years trying to figure out how to present his work in the most accessible public form. So they could be read by non-specialists. It could be read by workers. So it could have some meaning in the culture. And although Marx himself says, okay, actually the first chapter is a bit difficult, and it is. If you can slog your way through the fetishism of commodities, you'll know. But the rest of the work is it's unbelievably easy to read. Well, I'd say that. It's unbelievably straightforward. I said it's a rhetorical tour de force. Now, why here, right? The work is called Capital. He doesn't start off with capital. He starts off with a commodity. He thinks labor is what produces value. Doesn't start off with labor. He thinks surplus value and the drive for surplus value is what is the driving force of the economic system. Doesn't start off with surplus value. He starts off with the commodity. Why does he start off? And this is after he's thought this through. Where am I going to start that's going to lead people to where they're going to understand the system? And he starts with the commodity because he says, because it is both concrete and abstract. It is concrete in that it is how capitalism presents itself. It's the great revolutionary aspect of capitalism, which is its quantitative nature. Capitalism has solved the problem of production. There are more things now than there ever were. And that's this concrete value, but at the same time, if you can take that concrete and you can unpeel it, you can get to the logic, you can get to the core of the system. And as I said, Marx spent many years doing the work of translation, thinking about the work of translation, because it is not easy, it is not straightforward. Actually, I would also recommend not only Capital, I would also recommend, if you want a rhetorical tour de force, I would recommend the Communist Manifesto, which was very, very explicitly written to be read by workers. Actually, my own work on advertising stems from this understanding. Stems from, although I think if Marx were writing today, he would say the wealth of those societies in which the capitalist mode of production prevails presents itself as an immense accumulation of messages about commodities. Because in the modern world, what surrounds us is advertising about commodities. And I would actually start off there and then unpeel that to understand where we are today. And I think actually that's where Marx would have gone. This duality, okay, it's the duality of intellectual work, which is analysis and exposition. The mode of analysis and the mode of exposition, they're connected but not the same. They're connected but not the same. And I think this duality is what I regard as the center of the cultural studies project that I see myself in and that I certainly think Stuart Hall was in. This is, I'm going to come back to Stuart, this is Stuart Hall on what the role of organic intellectuals connected to social movements, what the role of organic intellectuals should be that he gets from Gramsci. Again, for Hall, Hall is certainly a Marxist, but if I had to describe him in any way, I actually would describe him as a Gramscian. I think actually he is a Gramscian Marxist. And that's why he spends so much time talking about Gramsci. And so he's now talking about Gramsci's notion of the organic intellectual. He says, the organic intellectual must work on two fronts at one and the same time. On the one hand, we have to be at the very forefront of intellectual theoretical work, because as Gramsci says, it is a job of the organic intellectual to know more than the traditional intellectuals do. Really know, not just pretend to know, not just to have the facility of knowledge, i.e. not just to talk the jargon, that's the facility of knowledge, i.e. not to do what happens mostly at grad school, right? But to have real knowledge, to know deeply and profoundly. So often knowledge of Marxism is pure recognition, the production again of what we have already known. Hence, but if you're in the game of hegemony, you have to be smarter than them. Hence, there are no theoretical limits from which cultural studies can turn back. That's the first thing. We have to understand the world better than anyone else, and that may require specialized language. That may require jargon to do that understanding. That may require, that's the language of science. However, the second, he says, but the second aspect is just as crucial, that the organic intellectual cannot absolve himself or herself from the responsibility of transmitting those ideas, that knowledge, through the intellectual function to those who do not belong professionally in the intellectual class. And unless these two fronts are operating at the same time, or at least unless these two ambitions are part of the project of cultural studies, you can get enormous theoretical advance without any engagement at the level of the political project. Actually, that kind of describes what cultural studies has become in the last 20 years. For me, these two ways of thinking about intellectual work are inseparable. And for me, they're mostly taken the form of film, how I approach a lot of the work these days. Actually, I'm kind of relentless on that. When I read a book or read an article, it's like, okay, how can I make a film on this? How can I translate this into a different form? And I've had to think about, as you think about the work of translation, I've also had to think about form a great deal. What can film do and what can it not do well? And I learned this actually the hard way, which is, Hall is one of the great, live, he's one of the great lecturers that I've ever seen. To be in the room with Stuart when he was talking was one of the great experiences of my life, because he was this incredible speaker. And so actually what I wanted to do, I thought, some of the work I did with Stuart, I'm going to film him to get this out so I can show. Actually, and when I filmed Stuart, I realized that something is lost. That actually lectures don't really work that well on film. Because lectures, and if you think about it, lectures are, you're talking to 100 people or whoever is in the room. Video is a personal medium. Video works well when you're talking to one person. That's why documentaries are full of people talking to an interviewer. They're not showing lectures, but lecturers doing stuff. Because that's the nature of the medium. You've got to recognize what the medium is about. I recognize myself. I mean, I was. This is around the same time. I did a talk. I still do a talk called "Advertising at the End of the World," and people really seem to understand the talk, and it seems to be energizing. And I went to film it. I thought, well, I'll just film my talk. And when I looked at it, I thought, oh, there's something lost here. There's energy, something is happening. And so I actually did a test. I did an interview in an interview format where I did exactly the same content as I did in the lecture. So on the one hand, I was in a kind of interview format. I was speaking to one person, and in the other one, I was in a lecture format talking to, and I did it as an experiment. I did it as an empirical test. I asked 10 people, what's better? And every single person said the interview was better. Same content, absolutely the same content, but the form of the medium that you're using influences what works and what doesn't work. And so I started to, I never really had thought about that before. But as I started to think about translation, I had to think not only about translating ideas, but also about the form in which that translation will happen. That way of thinking about translation is not very common on the left. It's actually much more common on the right, who have recognized the centrality of intellectual work and have funded it. The right has public intellectuals that they fund. Left academics learn to talk in a code that only a few people understand. It's one of the great tricks that somehow they did. Russell Jacoby talks about this in his wonderful book, The Dialectic of Defeat. Essentially, the left was siphoned off into the universities and then said, we'll give you a job for life, but you're just going to have to learn to speak in a language that no one else can understand. So you'll get published in peer-reviewed journals, and those 6 people who read it will think it's great, and no one else will understand it. And by the time you get to that, we've actually stopped. We don't know how to talk in any other way. We don't know how to translate that into any other way. So I'm always looking for ways of translating what I think are complex ideas into a more, what I know are complex ideas. I don't think they're complex ideas. Because this is not about simplifying. Like, this is not the world. I mean, if you want to understand the world, a complicated world, you've got to have a complicated understanding of it. This is not about dumbing it down. This is not about dumbing it. This is not about making. This is about how can you maintain the complexity in a different form. And so I'm always looking at, if you're talking about the students, I'm always looking at media for examples. You can actually find examples in media that kind of reflect or the kind of do some of the things you want to do. I'll give you one example. One of the areas I've worked in has been how value is drawn from the world of media. And one of the papers I wrote was something called Watching as Working, which argued that, in fact, when people are watching advertising on television, what they're doing is they're working the same way you would in a factory. The value is being drawn out of you. Right? If you don't watch television, what are the TV stations going to sell? Nothing. They have nothing to sell. If you're not watching, they have nothing to sell to advertisers. That means our watching is productive. That means our watching is at the center of value. Whatever value is being created, our watching is a productive activity. The television, in that sense, the way we want to think about television is not so much that television is putting messages into us, which is the way we've thought, but that television, commercial television, is drawing value out of us. It's taking things out of us, and that's our activity. That notion of couch potatoes, talking about the television audience, is the wrong way to. If we were couch potatoes, we'd be unconscious, and they couldn't sell us to advertisers. We have to be conscious. We have to be meaning creating. We have to be thinking about what we're watching. So it's a complicated. I mean, when I try and talk to my students about this, I get these blank looks back on my face, because essentially I'm trying to put the Marxist labor process onto the living room. In fact, the talk I do on this is called The Factory in the Living Room. And it's actually not a metaphor, it's actually a real factory that's in the living room. But I'm always looking for ways of showing this. And so I found one. It was, all of you know Harry Potter? The Harry Potter films? Right. Who are the monsters that steal your soul? Right, they're the Dementors. The Dementors don't come, they come along and they suck your soul out of you. That's television. Commercial television is a Dementor. Sorry, the audio may not be very high on this. That's television. If you can, how do you get this idea that it's not about putting into you, but it's about taking something out of you? Well, that was actually students actually started to kind of get it once you put it in these. So that is, you took a familiar form and you turned it around. Something that they understood, and you gave it a kind of different take. I was going to play you another clip. I'm not going to because I don't have time. But we also did a lecture with John Bracey. So we actually do lectures. You know, that's one of the major ways we do things. But we illustrate them in very, so the people aren't just speaking. You're visually illustrating what someone is talking about. And I did a lecture with John Bracey, who is an African American historian, works at UMass. On why racism was bad for white people as well. And he goes, it's just a kind of a tour through American history from slavery onwards. And so the challenge we had was, to make that visual. That's not the clip I'm going to show you because I don't have time. As I said, the central question that comes up that comes up from us is, who is our audiences? Who are our principal audiences? And I think our principal audiences, there could be many. For some things, there are other academics. And in other times, they're non-academics. They're students. And remember, these are students who may not be particularly amenable to what you're doing. If you're doing a job right, you will be challenging them. You will be disrupting them. In fact, my favorite evaluation, I think, of all time that I had at the end of the semester, my favorite evaluation was from someone who said, I guess it's good I know these things. I'd much rather not. Right? I'd much rather not. That's because knowing it means you're not innocent anymore. Knowing it means you have to take it into account. You may not agree with it. And this is not, as I said, this is not about propaganda. I don't think that's our role is not about propagandizing. It's not about saying, it's not about politicizing the classroom in that way. That's not our role. They get enough of that elsewhere. Our role is to get them to think about the world in the clearest way we think or the clearest way you can. And it's to give them the tools to be able to understand the world in different ways. What they do with that, that's up to them, right? That's not up to us. People have their own ethics, they have their own morality, they have their own whatever else however they want to use it, that's up to them. But our job is to disrupt. Our job is to show them there is this other way of looking at the world. And this is a better, it's better and not better morally, but this is empirically grounded. This is empirically grounded. This is not just opinion, this is about facts. Again, it's not just about spouting our opinion. It's about what's the best research that's out there. We're in a very good position. The best research out there, of course, about the world is, supports a progressive view of the world, supports a socialist, left-wing view of the world. That's one of the good things about about looking at this work. I give my students actually a choice at the start of the class. I discovered another clip, and it's a great clip, and students are really, not many of you actually, there's a film called The Matrix that many people I think would have seen. And there's a scene in The Matrix that I actually play at the end of my first class. And I say, this is what we are going to do. And the choice is yours. And it's a clip where Morpheus, who's the main leader of the underground, is talking to Neo before he becomes, about the choices that he has before him.
Let me tell you why you're here. You're here because you know something. What you know you can't explain, but you feel it. You felt it your entire life, that there's something wrong with the world. You don't know what it is, but it's there, like a splinter in your mind, driving you mad. It is this feeling that has brought you to me. Do you know what I'm talking about?
The Matrix.
Do you want to know what it is? The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us. Even now, in this very room. You can see it when you look out your window or when you turn on your television. You can feel it when you go to work, when you go to church, when you pay your taxes. It is the world that has been pulled over your eyes to blind you from the truth.
What truth?
That you are a slave, Neo. Like everyone else, you were born into bondage, born into a prison that you cannot smell or taste or touch. A prison for your mind. Unfortunately, no one can be told what the Matrix is. You have to see it for yourself. This is your last chance. After this, there is no turning back. You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Okay, so actually I showed this in my first class on advertising. The Matrix is advertising. That's the advertising system. It's could be capitalism, I mean. I'd say we're going to take, actually what is it? We're going to take the red pill. And the choice is yours. You want to take the red pill, you're in the class. If you don't want to take it, you should drop it today. Actually, at the end of the first class, people actually are coming out of the room saying, I'm going to take the red pill, I'm going to take the... And at the end of the class, they say, I'm really glad I took, they're really glad I took the red pill. I mean, to get people to remember something from the first class to the end is amazing. To get their students to remember something specific from over 13 weeks this is something they know. Again, this is not the first time they've seen this. They've seen this many times. This clip, this film is part of I mean, it's no longer generational. I mean, kids who are in college today have seen this film, and so you're taking it again and flipping it around. We also have choices to make. This is not only the choices of what you want to do. This is we also have choices to make about what we're going to spend our intellectual labor on the kinds of questions that we're going to look at. I'll play you. This is Stuart Hall at the end of his life. I did an interview with him about 18 months before he died. I think it's the last interview that he did actually on film. I haven't seen it since. I haven't seen anything other than that. And this is Stuart Stuart is a very modest guy. Never wanted to be the kind of policeman of cultural studies saying this is not cultural studies, even though I tried to get him to say that many times. But I think near the end of his life, he kind of had enough. And this is when he says, we have choices to make. This is Stuart.
I feel there's a kind of, nevertheless, I feel that there's a kind of choice of pathways going on. I think a lot of people in cultural studies think we can't just go on, you know, producing another analysis of The Sopranos. Sorry. Something more is happening in the world that requires our attention. I don't know that they know quite how to do it or where to go, but I do feel that shift of mood happening in cultural studies now.
Now, you can't just keep on producing another, you know, academic, I'll also use the word, an academic analysis of The Sopranos because it's so clever. There's limited intellectual capacity, limited intellectual energy we have, and what are you going to use it for? You're going to use it for something useful? You're going to use it for, I mean, that's the choices that we have. This is Hall talking about this. He talks about it, he calls it the worldliness of cultural studies. He says, this is a way of opening up the question of cultural studies, to borrow a term from Eblet Said. I'm not dwelling on the secular connotation of the metaphor of worldliness here, but on the worldliness of cultural studies. I'm dwelling on the dirtiness of it. The dirtiness of the semiotic game, if I can put it that way. I'm trying to return the project of cultural studies from the clean air of meaning and textuality and theory to the something nasty down below. That dirty semiotic world where knowledge and power intersect. And although Hall used the academy as his base, he was never an academic in that sense. He was an intellectual in the Gramscian sense. It was ideas applied to something in the world. Cultural studies has to have this worldliness to the kinds of things that it wants. I come back to the deadly seriousness of intellectual work. It is a deadly serious matter. I come back to the critical distinction between intellectual work and academic work. They overlap. They abut with one another. They feed off one another. The one provides you with the means to do the other, but they are not the same thing. I come back to the difficulty of instituting a genuine cultural and critical practice which is intended to produce some kind of organic intellectual political work. As a practice which always thinks about its intervention in a world in which it would make some difference, in which it would have some effect. Those are the choices we have. Those are choices, individual choices we have as to what we want to do in our careers, what we want to, and what kind of intellectuals we want to be. It's the same thing, actually, I got this quote from Henry in one of his articles. It's the quote from Zygmunt Bauman, essentially saying what the choices are. He says, I do not believe that a student of human reality may be ethically neutral. The sole choice we face is one between loyalty to the humiliated and to beauty, and indifference to both. It is like any other choice a moral being confronts between taking and refusing to take responsibility for one's responsibility. Remember, intellectual work is important. He's not saying just, this is all, I mean, there has been a kind of fetishization of activism. I think it's crazy, the fetishism of activism, you know, because activism without knowing how you want to intervene in the world is crazy. It will lead to nothing. But there is almost, there is this, as I said, this crazy fetishism on the left. I want to end with this famous phrase from Gramsci. Pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. It's a phrase I'm sure you've heard. I think it's also one of the most misunderstood terms, most misunderstood phrases, at least on the left. This is Hall talking about it. He says,
Gramsci used to say, pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will. What he meant is, understand how the bloody system works. What confronts you? The fact that the terrain is not favorable to your project. Understand that, even if it disillusions you, even if it makes you awake at night. Understand it. Then you're in a position to say, well, what can change? Where are the emergent forces? Where are the cracks and the contradictions? What are the elements in popular consciousness one could mobilize for a different political program.
What he meant is understand how the bloody system works first. Understand how it works, what confronts you, the fact that the terrain is not favorable to your project. Understand that even if it disillusions you, even if it makes you awake at night, understand it. Then you're in a position to say, well, what can change? What are the emergent forces? Where are the cracks and the contradictions? What are the elements of public consciousness one could mobilize for a political program? Okay, Marx, even in his time, said the choice was between barbarism and socialism. And that choice is still the same. I think we have been living in very barbaric times. And at this point in human history, the stakes are very high. Neoliberalism as a practice and philosophy could well be the last stage of a trajectory that fundamentally divides human beings into a minority that deserve to live decent, fulfilling lives, and the majority condemned to eke out a life that could barely be called human. That's our present situation. That's where we are right now. What are the responsibility of academics at this time? How do we use the relative privilege that we have been given, that we have been granted? How do we to intervene in this project? Do we ask the fundamental questions of the age and struggle to make them important in the world? Or do we remain academic? You know, when someone says, oh, that's just academic, what are they saying? That's just useless. It's irrelevant, right? You're irrelevant. And the last thing I want to be is irrelevant. The last thing I want to be is an academic.